It was just before 9:45 on a winter night, and the largest cruise ship Italy had ever sent to sea was showing off. Her lights burned across the water toward the sleeping island of Giglio, close enough for the people on shore to wave. On her bridge, a captain stood without his reading glasses, steering by memory toward rocks he swore he knew. Then the sea opened her along the port side, a wound as long as a football pitch, and the lights that were meant to dazzle an island went black. 4,252 souls were aboard. 32 of them would never reach the harbour they had come to salute, and one would stay inside her for almost 3 years. The reef was on every chart. So why did she ever turn toward it? If the great ships and the nights that broke them pull at you, subscribe and stay to the end, because what put the Costa Concordia on the rocks was not bad luck or bad weather, but a choice. She was built to carry 4,000 people in comfort past the loveliest coasts of Europe, and her 13 decks each wore the name of a nation. There was a deck called Italia and a deck called Francia, a deck for Spain and one for Greece and one for Great Britain, as though the whole continent had been folded into a single hull and set afloat on the Mediterranean for a week of sunshine and forgetting. That was the idea of her. Her name said it plainly. Concordia, harmony, the wish for lasting peace between the nations of Europe, spelled out on the side of a ship that was itself a small floating Europe, gleaming and warm and utterly sure of itself. She belonged to Costa, the great Italian cruise line, and behind Costa stood the largest holiday fleet in the world. When she entered service in the summer of 2006, she was among the biggest passenger ships ever built in Italy, and she was built to feel bigger still. She ran near 290 meters from bow to stern, longer than the Titanic by more than the length of a tennis court, and she rose deck upon deck above the water until she looked less like a ship than a district of a city that had somehow slipped its moorings and gone to sea. Inside her, the numbers lost their meaning and became simply luxury. There were 4 swimming pools, 2 of them under roofs that slid back to let the sun in. There were 5 restaurants and 13 bars, a bar for cigars and a bar for chocolate, a theatre that climbed through 3 stories, a casino, a discotheque, an internet cafe, even a simulator that let a passenger pretend to drive a racing car while the real Mediterranean slid past the windows. Her wellness centre alone ran to 6,000 square metres, larger than most towns could boast on dry land, with a pool fed by seawater and a Turkish bath and a solarium high above the waves. She was, in every plank and fitting, a machine for pleasure. Nobody who booked a cabin aboard her was thinking about the sea as a danger. The sea was scenery. It was the blue backdrop to the buffet and the sun deck, the thing you photographed from the rail with a drink in your hand. That was the whole promise of a ship like the Concordia, that the ocean had been tamed into a view, that a family from Germany or France or Italy could step aboard and hand their safety over completely, and never once have to think about it again. And for more than 5 years, she kept that promise. She ran her circuits of the Western Mediterranean, port to port, week after week, carrying her thousands in comfort and delivering them home again brown and rested, and none the wiser about the machinery of risk that hummed beneath their feet. She was reliable. She was admired. She was, by the ordinary measure of these things, a complete success. A proud ship of a proud line, named for the harmony of a continent. She was named for harmony, and she would die in chaos, within sight of land, on a calm and windless night, brought down by nothing the sea did to her. To understand how that was possible, you have to go back to the very beginning, to the day they first put her in the water, and to a small, strange thing that happened there that the old sailors on the slipway did not like at all. At her launch, the champagne bottle swung against her hull and did not shatter, and the old sailors on the slipway went quiet. It is one of the oldest superstitions the sea has. The bottle must break on the bow, the wine must run down the steel, or the ship goes into the water unblessed and carries the bad luck with her ever after. On the 2nd day of September, 2005, at the Fincantieri yard in Genoa, the great model chosen to christen the Costa Concordia swung the bottle against her towering side, and it struck, and it held, and it did not break. Nobody in the crowd made much of it. It was a fine, bright day and a magnificent ship, and the failure of a bottle was the kind of thing you laughed off. Only the sailors remembered. She had been ordered in the January of 2004, a single ship costing the better part of €500 million, and she was the first of a whole new class, the pride of an industry then racing to build ever larger floating resorts for a booming holiday trade. The yard at Sestri Ponente laid her down and raised her up section by section, a hull of a scale Italy had rarely built, and delivered her to Costa in the summer of 2006. She was christened in July and sailed on her maiden voyage a week later, and everything about her spoke of confidence and money and the certainty that the good years would go on forever. But a film about how she died has to look past the marble and the glass, because the things that would kill her were designed into her from the first drawing, and they were hidden in plain sight. Consider first her shape. She was enormously tall and wide, deck stacked upon deck, a vast superstructure of cabins and lounges and open decks, and all of it rode on a hull that reached only some 8 meters below the waterline. A ship built like that is perfectly steady in ordinary service, but let the sea into her low down and off to one side, and a hull like that will not sink so much as topple. She would lean and go on leaning, faster and further than anyone aboard could believe, until the decks that had been floors became walls. Consider next her heart, which was electrical. Everything she did by the current running through her. Her engines were driven by it. Her steering leaned on it. Her lights, her pumps, her lifts, her radios, the very announcements that would tell 4,000 people whether to be afraid. All of it ran on power generated deep in her belly, in the engine spaces near the bottom of the ship. She was a marvel of modern engineering, and her marvelous modern engineering was gathered in exactly the place the sea would reach first. Here was the loaded gun, laid on the table in the opening act, a hull that would capsize rather than settle, and a nervous system that lived where the water would come in. In calm service, neither flaw mattered in the slightest. For more than 5 years they lay dormant, harmless, invisible, while she carried her happy thousands around the sunlit sea. It would take a very particular kind of mistake to wake them, a mistake no storm and no iceberg would ever make, a mistake that could only come from a human hand on her wheel. And the hand that would make it belonged to a man who, on the night it mattered, wanted more than anything to be admired. The bottle had not broken. The sailors had gone quiet. And somewhere in the fleet, a captain who loved an audience was working his way toward the command of her. Francesco Schettino had commanded ships for Costa for 11 years, and he loved the salute, the great lit hull leaning in toward a shore full of watching eyes. There is an old habit in the cruise trade, a piece of pure theatre with an Italian name, the incino, the bow, the curtsy. A captain takes his enormous ship in close to a coast or a harbour, closer than he ever needs to go, and turns her broadside to the land with every light blazing, so that the people ashore can gasp at the size and the beauty of her, and the passengers at the rail can wave down at the tiny figures on the beach. It serves no purpose of navigation. It is a performance, ship as spectacle, and Schettino was fond of it. He had done it before at Giglio, that small green island off the coast of Tuscany, and done it with the blessing of his employers. In the August of 2011, only months earlier, the Concordia had made a sail past of the island during a local festival, in daylight, approved in advance by the company, a lovely sight of a great ship lit up against the summer evening. The mayor of Giglio had thanked the captain afterward for the spectacle. "It is a very nice show," he said, "to see the ship all lit up from the land. It had gone perfectly. It had earned applause and thanks and photographs, and it had taught everyone involved a dangerous lesson, that you could bring a giant in toward the rocks and be praised for it." Schettino was, by every account, a capable and experienced master. He had spent his working life at sea. He knew ships, and he thought he knew these waters. And he had the particular confidence of a man who has done a risky thing many times and never once been punished for it. That confidence is its own kind of flaw. The audience knew, watching him, what the crew aboard could not: that a man who trusts a trick because it has always worked is a man who will one day try it on the wrong night. For the island of Giglio was not an ideal stage. Its eastern shore, just south of the little harbour, carried a reef that every chart in the world marked plainly, a scatter of rock the locals called le scole, the rocks, lying just beneath the surface where the deep water shelved suddenly toward the land. The safe route past the island, the route programmed into the ship's own navigation, kept her a good 5 miles off, well clear of all of it, out where the water stayed deep and forgiving. To perform the salute, a captain had to leave that safe line and steer deliberately toward the shore, toward the shallows, toward the rocks, trusting his own eye to find the narrow margin between a beautiful show and a catastrophe. There was a further temptation aboard that particular ship on that particular run. The head waiter of the Concordia was himself a man of Giglio, born on the island, and the idea had formed of saluting his home in the dark so that he could see it from the sea, and perhaps so that the island could see the ship carrying its own sun past its shore. It was a warm idea, a generous one even, the sort of gesture that makes a captain popular. It was also the precise sort of small, human, sentimental reason that turns a routine passage into a fatal detour. So the plan was set, quietly, without ceremony. On the evening of the 13th of January, 2012, the Costa Concordia would leave her safe programmed line and lean in toward Giglio at night to put on a show. Everything about it felt harmless. It had all been done before. And the reef waited in the dark exactly where the charts said it would, 8 meters down, patient as only rock can be. She left Civitavecchia in the early evening with more than 4,200 souls aboard, and 600 of them had never once stood at a lifeboat drill. It was the first leg of a 7-day cruise, a familiar circuit that would take her from the Italian coast up to Savona and on around the western Mediterranean, calling at ports she had visited scores of times. The ship slipped her lines and stood out to sea a little after 7 in the evening, 3,206 passengers and more than 1,000 crew settling into the first night of their holiday, dinner being served in the great tiered dining rooms, the ordinary happy machinery of a cruise getting underway. Set the human arithmetic of her against the coming hour, and it turns cold. More than 4,200 people were carried on her that night, of whom fewer than half were crew. Around 600 passengers had come aboard only that same day, joining the ship fresh at Civitavecchia, and for those 600, no muster drill had yet been held. They did not know where their assembly station was. They had not stood in their life jackets on the deck and counted the boats. They did not know, most of them, the first thing about how to leave the ship if the ship had to be left. The drill was scheduled for the following afternoon. The sea does not consult a schedule. Among all those thousands, only a handful of choices mattered, and every one of them was made on the bridge. There, the captain gave the order that would take her off her safe line. The programmed route, the one the ship would have sailed on her own, held her out around 5 miles from Giglio, clear of everything. Schettino ordered the deviation. He would bring her in the dark, to lean her past the island in a salute, trading the safe deep water offshore for a pass of only a few 100 meters from the shore, a margin thinner than the length of the ship herself. It is worth sitting for a moment with how needless it all was. There was no weather driving her toward the land. There was no fault in her engines, no fire, no emergency, nothing forcing her hand. The night was calm. The ship was sound. Every single person aboard was safe, and would have stayed safe had she simply held her course and passed the island far out in the dark as her own computers wished to do. The danger she was about to meet was not waiting for her on her route. She had to leave her route and go and find it, and she went to find it lit up like a carnival. The whole point of the salute was to be seen, so every light she had was burning, decks and portholes, and the great tiers of her superstructure blazing out across the black water toward Giglio, a floating cathedral of light standing in toward a village that had gone to bed. On the island, a few people noticed her, closer than the ships usually came, unusually bright, unusually near. From the shore, she was a spectacle. From the bridge, she was a performance in progress, the captain and his officers bending her track toward the land, the head waiter from the island brought up to watch, the mood loose and social and pleased with itself. She leaned toward Giglio, all her lights ablaze, and somewhere ahead of her bow, still out of sight in the dark, the water shelved up toward the rocks the charts had marked for 100 years. She was steaming toward them at speed, and on her bridge the man in command had already begun to do the thing that would leave him blind. The captain turned off part of the alarm system and left his reading glasses down in his cabin and told his officer to watch the radar for him. Each of those, on its own, is a small thing. Together, they are the picture of a man taking the safeguards off a moving ship one by one. He would say later, plainly, without shame, that he had been navigating by sight. "I knew those seabeds well," he told the investigators. "I had done the move 3 or 4 times." He was steering a vessel longer than the Titanic, carrying more than 4,000 lives toward a charted reef in the dark. And he was doing it by eye, on memory, with the automatic warnings that might have shouted at him switched off. His first officer would tell the court a detail that is hard to forget. The captain had left his glasses in his cabin, and through those last minutes, he kept asking the officer to read the radar for him, to tell him what the instruments showed, because he could not see them clearly himself. Picture it. The one man with the authority to turn the ship cannot read his own screens, and instead of slowing, instead of standing off, instead of sending someone for the glasses, he presses on toward the rocks and asks another man to be his eyes. The bridge in those minutes was not the taut, silent place it should have been. It was crowded and warm and pleased with itself. The head waiter from Giglio had been invited up to see his island. A young woman had come to the bridge too, a dancer from the ship's company who had not paid for a passage and who would later tell the court she had been in a relationship with the captain. The prosecutors would argue that her presence there at that hour generated confusion and distraction at the one place on the ship where confusion was lethal. Whatever passed between them, the plain fact remains that the nerve center of a giant closing on a reef was doing the work of a viewing gallery, and she was closing fast. The prosecutors would allege that Schettino had earlier slowed the ship so that he could finish his dinner in peace, and then, to make up the lost time, had pushed her speed back up to around 16 knots as she ran in toward the island. 16 knots is not a reckless speed on the open sea. Run it toward rocks a few hundred meters off a dark shore, with the alarms muted and the captain unable to read his instruments, and it becomes the speed of a loaded weapon. A ship that size does not stop and does not turn in anything less than a wide and patient arc. Whatever lay ahead of her, she was committed to meeting it long before anyone aboard would see it come. Now leave the warm, bright bridge for a moment and go out ahead of her into the dark, down to the thing that was waiting. Just south of the harbour of Giglio, some 800 meters off the mouth of the little port, lay the reef of Le Scole, and the most seaward stone of it, the outermost rock, was called Scola Piccola, the Little Rock. It sat about 8 meters below the surface, invisible in the night, unmoving, marked on every chart the ship carried. It had been there for longer than there had been ships. It asked nothing and threatened nothing. It simply waited, in the exact spot the charts recorded, for something large enough and blind enough to come and find it. On the bridge, the captain peered into the dark toward a shore he could not quite make out, steering a ship he could not quite see the instruments of, at a speed chosen to make up for lost time. And then, out in the black water ahead, low and pale, he caught sight of the thing no chart can convey and no memory can substitute for. White water. Waves breaking over rock, dead ahead, far too close. He saw the white water too late, and swung the great hull the wrong way, and for a moment the whole ship held her breath. The order came in a rush, a hard turn to try to throw her stern clear of the rocks his bow had already almost reached. But a ship of near 114,000 tons does not answer a wheel the way a car answers a hand. She began her turn slowly, majestically, far too slowly, her long flank swinging out across the very water where the reef lay hidden. There is a phrase from the bridge that night, recorded in the aftermath, that carries the whole horror of the moment in a handful of words. Otherwise, we go on the rocks. He knew. In the last seconds, he knew exactly what was about to happen, and there was no longer time or sea room to prevent it. Understand what a turn like that does to a ship. To swing her stern away from the rock, the captain had to throw her side toward it, and so the maneuver meant to save her was the very thing that laid her open. Instead of striking the reef bow on, a blow her forward structure might have taken and survived, she came across it broadside, dragging her long port flank over the stone. It was the worst possible way for her to meet the rock, and it was the direct result of the correction, made too late, by a man steering by eye in the dark. Slow the moment down, because everyone aboard was about to feel it. In the dining rooms, dinner was being served, the tables full, the ordinary murmur of a first evening at sea. In the cabins, families were unpacking, children half asleep, the just embarked 600 still learning their way around the corridors. On the open decks, a few passengers watched the lights of Giglio slide past, unusually close, and thought only how pretty the island looked. Not one of them knew that the ship was already turning, already committed, already within a few meters of a rock that every officer aboard should have kept her miles away from. And out ahead, Scola Piccola waited, 8 meters down, the little rock with the small name. It had no malice in it. It was simply there, precisely where it had always been, precisely where the charts said. The ship, blazing with light, loaded with her thousands, driving in toward the shore at 16 knots to perform a bow for a sleeping village, closed the last of the distance between herself and the stone. There was nothing left that could be done. The turn was begun and could not be hurried. The speed was set and could not be shed. The margin was gone. This was the point of no return, and it is worth marking it clearly, because everything before it was choice and everything after it was consequence. Before this instant, the disaster could still have been called off with a single order, a turn back to the safe line, a decision to pass the island far out in the dark, as the ship herself wished to do. After this instant, nothing anyone did could keep the sea out of her. The reckless salute had brought her to the one place on all that dark coast where the water reached up to meet a careless keel, and now the two of them, the giant and the little rock, came together in the night. Then it happened. A long, grinding, shuddering blow ran the whole length of her from bow to stern, a sound and a shock that everyone aboard would remember for the rest of their lives. The feel of the ship striking something vast and immovable and taking the wound of it into her very bones. The lights flickered. Glass fell. The great hull trembled from end to end. And in the dining rooms, 4,000 people looked up from their plates in the sudden silence that follows a catastrophe, not yet knowing that their beautiful floating city had, in that single instant, begun to die. At 9:45, the port side struck, and the sea tore a gash near 50 meters long below the waterline. The rock opened her the way a blade opens a hull, a great ragged tear running along her flank beneath the sea, so long it defied belief, near half the length of a football pitch of steel, peeled and split by the reef. The blow was so violent that 2 long strips of her hull were sheared clean off and left behind on the seabed, where divers would later find them lying near 100 meters from the shore, torn ribbons of a ship that had passed by too close. Into that wound the Mediterranean poured, cold and black and endless, faster than any pump aboard could answer. And the water went straight for her heart. The tear lay along the lowest, most vital part of her, and behind it were the very spaces where her power was made, the engine rooms, the generators, the electrical machinery on which every single thing aboard depended. Within minutes, the head of the engine room was on the line to the captain with the worst news a mariner can carry, that the gash was beyond saving, that the sea was already over the generators and climbing. The water found her nervous system and drowned it. Deep in her belly, the lights died first, and then, spreading outward and upward through the great hull, the power began to fail all through the ship. Here the loaded gun of her design went off. She was a vessel that ran entirely on the current made in her flooded belly, and now that current was failing. Her engines, robbed of power, fell still. She could no longer drive. She could no longer properly steer. A ship of near 114,000 tons, longer than the Titanic, was suddenly a dead weight in the water, carried on nothing but her own momentum and the last angle of her rudders, coasting silently through the dark, past the harbour of Giglio, while the sea filled her from below. Down in the machinery spaces, men fought the losing fight that the passengers above knew nothing about. The chief engineer and his officers tried to start the emergency generator, the last reserve of power that might have kept her lights burning and her pumps working and her steering alive. It coughed. It failed. It would not take up the load. And with that failure, the ship's last chance of controlling her own fate slipped away into the rising water. She was without propulsion, without full power, without the means to fight the flood, drifting on inertia alone, her enormous lit bulk gliding past the little port like a wounded animal that has not yet fallen. Give the scale of her flooding a shape the mind can hold. A tear near 50 meters in the side of a hull is not a leak to be plugged. It is an opening as long as the reef that made it, admitting the weight of the sea by the ton every second, into spaces never meant to hold it. Behind that wound lay the drowned engines, the dead generators, the failed reserve, and above them, the 13 decks of a floating city with 4,200 people in it, most of them still at their dinner, many of them still believing that the great shudder they had felt was some passing fault that the crew would soon put right. For a strange, suspended interval, that belief could still hold. She was down by no great amount yet. She was still upright. Her remaining lights still burned. To a passenger in the dining room, shaken but unhurt, it might still seem that nothing truly terrible had happened, that this was an inconvenience and not a catastrophe. And in that gap, between what the passengers were feeling and what the sea had already decided, the ship began to be filled with a sound that would haunt everyone who survived her. Not the roar of water, the soothing voice of the crew telling 4,000 frightened people over and over that everything was under control. While the water climbed through her belly, the passengers in the dining hall were told it was only an electrical fault, and the song from the film Titanic played on. It is almost too cruel to be believed, but it is true, remembered by more than one survivor. As the great ship lay wounded and the sea rose in her, the music that drifted through the public rooms was the love theme from the most famous shipwreck in history, the mournful melody of a film about a liner going down with the loss of 1,500 souls. Beneath it, the announcements told the passengers to stay calm, that the ship had suffered a blackout, an electrical problem, nothing more, that everything was under control. That lie cost lives. It was not only spoken to the passengers, it was spoken to the shore. When the harbour master of Giglio, alarmed by reports, made contact with the ship a little after 10, an officer aboard insisted that they had suffered only an electrical failure. The truth, that a reef had torn a 50-metre wound in her side and drowned her engines, was held back. And so the precious first minutes, when the ship was still upright and her lifeboats could still have been swung out and lowered in good order, were spent reassuring people rather than saving them. A passenger filmed the scene not long after the strike, crew in the public rooms telling frightened, life-jacketed guests that all was well, that they should return to their cabins. Return to their cabins as the sea climbed the decks below. Only after 10 did the captain admit to the harbour master what had truly happened, that she had taken water through an opening in her port side and asked for a tug. And still, the order that mattered most did not come. The formal alert to the port authorities went out only around 11:15, the better part of an hour after the rock. And the order to abandon ship, the order to get 4,000 people off a dying vessel, was not given until 10 minutes to 11 at night, more than an hour after the impact. An hour. An hour in which she had been settling and beginning to lean. An hour in which the one thing that could still be done in safety was quietly running out. For as she drifted, she had turned, coming slowly back around toward the island, and she had begun to lean. First a little, then more. A list to her starboard side that grew and would not stop. 20 degrees. And here the second flaw of her design closed like a trap. A ship that leans that far throws half her lifeboats useless. The boats on the high side, lifted away from the water by the tilt of the hull, could no longer be lowered down her flank. They hung out over empty air or scraped and jammed against the rising steel, unlaunchable, while the crowds that needed them gathered helpless on the sloping decks. The very lean that her tall, shallow hull made inevitable had turned half her means of escape into so much dead weight bolted to the sky. Now the withheld horror arrived. The thing planted in the very first minutes paid off at last. The lean went on. 30 degrees. 40. The floors of the corridors became slopes, then walls, Furniture slid and crashed. Tableware avalanched across the dining rooms. People who had been calmly queuing found themselves clinging to railings above a drop, climbing sideways along passages that had become cliffs, hauling children upward through a world tilted past all sense. She heeled further, past 50 degrees, past 60, until she came to rest against an underwater ledge near the shore at an angle close to 70 degrees, half of her in the sea and half of her in the air, the great lit city lying on her side within swimming distance of the village she had come to greet. And in that tilted, roaring dark, the first of the 32 began to die. Somewhere in the chaos, the captain climbed into a lifeboat and did not go back, and a voice on the radio told him what a man was supposed to do. By the reckoning of the investigators, Francesco Schettino was off his ship well before it was over, gone from her by around 11:30, while some 300 people were still aboard the tilting hull, clinging and climbing and waiting to be taken off. He would claim, later, that he had not chosen to leave, that he had tripped and fallen into the boat, that the darkness and the tilt had somehow tipped him off his own command and into safety. Few believed it. What is certain is that he did not go back, that from the relative safety of the boat he did not return to the hundreds still trapped above him. And into that failure came the voice that Italy would never forget. On the radio from the port authority at Livorno was an officer of the coastguard, Gregorio De Falco, and when he understood that the master of the Costa Concordia was sitting in a lifeboat while his passengers were still aboard the wreck, he lost all patience with him. "Get back on board," he ordered, again and again, his fury crackling across the channel. The words he used were coarse and plain and unforgettable, a commander's rage at a captain who had run, and within days they were printed on shirts and repeated across the whole country. Get back on board. It became the cry of a nation's disgust, and its longing, in the same breath, for the kind of man who does not leave. Above the fleeing captain, through the long, cold hours of the night, the rescue went on without him. Boats came out from Giglio, the islanders themselves putting to sea to pull people from the water and off the rocks. Helicopters from the Coast Guard and the Navy and the Air Force clattered over the tilted hull in turns, lowering men onto the wreck and lifting survivors off it into the dark, 1 and 2 at a time, hour after hour. The people of that small island opened their homes, their church, their hotels, taking in the cold and the frightened and the barely dressed as they came ashore, wrapping them in blankets, giving them beds. For their kindness that night, the island would later be honoured by the whole country. And there were those the sea had trapped, whose ordeal outlasted the night by more than a day. Deep in the hull, a young married couple from South Korea, on their honeymoon, woke to find their cabin door jammed shut by the tilt of the ship. The corridor outside a flooded slope, no way out. They waited in the dark, 2 decks above the waterline, while the hours passed and the searchers worked toward them. More than 24 hours after the ship struck the rock, rescuers reached them and a crewman trapped near them and brought them out alive, 3 lives pulled from a wreck that had already been given up as still. That any of them lived is its own small miracle, set against the 32 for whom no one came in time. By the small hours, the last of the living were being lifted from her. The ship's priest was among the final figures leaving the wreck. Somewhere near 2 in the morning, the Coast Guard was still logging one furious call after another to the captain who would not return. And at last, after an ordeal of more than 6 hours from the first blow to the final rescue, the harbour master's record noted the words that closed the night: evacuation complete. The living were ashore. The great lit city was dark now, and still, lying on her side in the shallows, the water lapping at her flank. And the counting of the dead, which would take not hours, but years, had only just begun. When the tally was finally done, 32 people were dead, and the sea would give some of them back only years later. 27 of them were passengers, holidaymakers, who had come aboard for a week in the sun, and 5 of them were crew. They came from across the very Europe her decks had been named for and beyond it. 12 were German, 6 Italian, 6 French. There were dead from Peru and Hungary and India among the crew, dead from the United States and Spain among the passengers. Behind each number was a person who had stepped aboard a pleasure ship expecting nothing worse than a sunburn, and behind the whole cold sum of 32 lay the single, simple truth that not one of them needed to have died. The recovery of the bodies was a slow and terrible business, drawn out across years by the very state of the wreck. She lay on her side, half-flooded, a maze of tilted corridors and drowned cabins, and the divers who went into her risked their lives in the dark to bring the lost back out. Some were found in the first days. Others took weeks, then months. 2 of the last victims were located in the January after the disaster, but could not be reached at all, sealed inside a part of the ship that the divers could not enter until the wreck itself had been rotated upright more than a year and a half later. The families of the missing were made to wait and wait, while the great grey hull that had killed their people kept its grip on them, and through all of it, one name stayed missing longer than any other, the thread that runs from the very first minutes of this story to its end. Russell Rebello was a crewman, an Indian waiter aboard the Concordia, and by the accounts of those who survived, he had stayed to the last to help passengers into the boats, giving up his own place to see others off the ship. When the tally of the dead was made, he was on it, but his body was not found. Not in the days after, not in the weeks, not in the long months while the wreck was fought over by salvors. He remained inside her, somewhere in the drowned steel, the last of the lost, while the world moved on to the trials and the arguments and the enormous business of raising the ship. Set against those 32 are the 4,200 and more who lived, and their survival was its own strange lottery. Most got off because the ship, for all the chaos, had grounded in shallow water close to shore, because the islanders came, because the helicopters flew all night, because a great many crew, whatever the failures above them, did their duty on the tilted decks. Some lived because they ignored the orders to stay in their cabins and made for the boats anyway. Some lived because strangers hauled them up a sloping corridor. The margin between the living and the dead that night was often only a matter of which side of the ship a person happened to be on when she rolled, and how long they had believed the voice that told them everything was under control. There is a phrase that one writer reached for to measure what had happened, and it cuts to the bone of it. The loss of the Costa Concordia, he said, was among the most significant events in modern maritime history, because every single safety procedure designed to make sea travel safe had failed. Every one. The charts that marked the reef, the route that avoided it, the alarms that might have warned, the drills the newest passengers never had, the announcements that told the truth to no one, the lifeboats that could not be launched, the captain who left. A whole century of hard-learned safety built up shipwreck by shipwreck since the Titanic, and it had all come to nothing on a calm night against a rock that everyone had known was there. And so the question turned, as it always does, from how they died to who would answer for it. Somewhere on shore, in a lifeboat's wake, a captain was already trying to explain himself, and a nation was about to sit in judgment not only on him, but on the 2 very different kinds of men it had watched that night. A nation watched 2 of its men that night, one who ran and one who ordered him back, and it saw itself in both. On the one side stood Schettino, The master who had taken his ship off her safe line to show off, who had steered her onto the rocks by eye in the dark, who had waited an hour to order the evacuation, and then left while hundreds of his passengers still clung to the wreck. On the other stood DeFalco, the coastguard officer who had never been aboard, who had grasped the horror in a moment and roared at the captain to go back and do his duty. A newspaper columnist wrote that the two men were the two souls of Italy, the coward who shirks and the officer who understands at once what is owed. The country recognized both, and it knew which one it wished to be. The law moved on the captain quickly. He was arrested the day after the sinking and questioned, held first in jail and then under house arrest on suspicion of a grim list of charges, of causing the shipwreck through his own recklessness, of manslaughter for the deaths that followed, of abandoning his passengers, of not having been the last to leave the ship as a master must be. In the months that followed, more charges were added, of having abandoned people unable to save themselves, of failing to tell the maritime authorities the truth of what had happened. The evidence against him was, in large part, his own words and his own recorded voice. The admission that he had been navigating by sight, the tape from the bridge, the furious refusals to return. Others answered too, though far more lightly. 5 people connected to the disaster, officers of the ship and managers of the company, reached plea bargains a year and a half after the sinking and were found guilty of their parts in it, of the chaos of the evacuation, of the delays, of the understating of the danger. Their sentences ran from around a year to under 3 years, and by the ordinary workings of Italian justice, where short sentences for such offences are routinely suspended, not one of them went to prison. The company that owned her, Costa, avoided a trial of its own by agreeing to pay a fine of €1 million. To the families of the dead, watching the ledger of blame being settled in suspended sentences and quiet fines, it felt like no reckoning at all. They called the sentences shameful. The captain alone faced the full weight of it. His trial ran long, the evidence mountainous, the recordings played back to a watching country. And in the end, in the early months of 2015, Francesco Schettino was convicted of multiple manslaughter for the 32 dead, of causing the shipwreck, of abandoning ship. He was sentenced to 16 years. He appealed and lost, and appealed again to the highest court in the land, and lost again. Until in the spring of 2017, the sentence was made final, and he was taken to serve it in a prison in Rome. The showman who had leaned his ship in toward an island to be admired would spend his years behind walls, the most notorious sea captain of his age. But a criminal sentence, however long, does not raise a ship, and it does not close a wound in the sea. For all through the trials and the appeals, the Costa Concordia herself remained exactly where she had fallen, lying on her side against the rocks of Giglio, vast and grey and impossible to ignore, a wreck the length of 3 football pitches slumped in the shallows of a holiday island. She had killed 32 people and destroyed a captain and shamed a company, and still she lay there, in plain view, holding the last of her dead inside her, waiting for someone to work out how on earth a thing so large could ever be taken away. For almost 1,000 days, the great ship lay broken against the island she had come to greet, a grey monument no one could look away from. She had become the strangest of landmarks, a capsized city on the doorstep of a village, her flank rising from the water where the ferries passed, her name still legible along the hull. Tourists photographed her. The islanders lived beside her. And the world's engineers gathered to face a problem without real precedent: how to lift a wreck of near 114,000 tons off a reef in one piece, without breaking her apart and spilling her poison into one of the most protected seas in the Mediterranean. for she was full of poison. Deep in her tanks lay some 2,500 tons of heavy fuel oil, and the waters around Giglio were a sanctuary for whales and dolphins, a stretch of sea set apart for its wildlife. So before anything else, in the weeks after the sinking, salvage crews carefully drew the fuel out of her, tank by tank, to spare the sanctuary the second disaster of a great slick. Then came the far harder task, the raising of the ship herself. A team of salvors, led by a South African master named Nick Sloan, built an underwater cradle for her against the seabed, welded enormous hollow tanks to her exposed side, and prepared to do something never attempted at such a scale, to roll a wrecked liner upright where she lay. They called it parbuckling, the slow rotation of the hull off her side and back onto her keel. And in the September of 2013, the world watched it done. Cables and the flooding of the great tanks pulled at her, degree by patient degree, less than 2 degrees in an hour, the whole vast bulk of her groaning upright out of the sea over the better part of 2 days. When it was finished, in the small hours of a September morning, she stood vertical again for the first time in 20 months, streaked and ruined and dead, but upright, resting on the cradle the engineers had built beneath her. It was one of the largest salvage operations ever attempted, and it had worked. There was a price paid even in the raising of her. During the long work on the wreck, a diver on the Salvage lost his life, cutting his leg on a sheet of her torn steel and dying of the wound. One more life taken by the Costa Concordia more than 2 years after she fell. And there was, at last, a recovery that the families had waited 3 years to hear. Only after she was upright, only after the divers could reach the parts of her that had lain drowned and sealed, was the final missing man found within her. In the November of 2014, they brought out the body of Russell Rebello, the waiter who had stayed to help others off, the last of the 32 to leave the ship, almost 3 years after she struck the rock. The sea had kept him longest of all, and now, at last, she gave him back. In the summer of 2014, they refloated what was left of her on her welded tanks and towed her away, dead slow. 2 knots, a broken giant under escort of more than a dozen vessels on her final voyage to the breakers at Genoa, the very city that had built her. There, over the following years, she was taken apart entirely, cut down deck by deck, and melted back into steel, until nothing of the Costa Concordia remained but the scrap she was rendered into and the memory of what she had done. The whole affair, the compensation and the salvage and the towing and the breaking, would cost something near $2 billion, more than 3 times what it had cost to build her. On the island of Giglio, the great boulder that had been driven into her hull by the reef, a stone weighing some 80 tons, was lifted out and set on the shore as a memorial, so that the island would never forget the 32 who died in its water. She was named for harmony and built for pleasure, and she lies now only in memory and in scrap, undone by nothing the sea chose to do to her. The lights that were meant to dazzle an island had gone black in an instant, and the reef had been on every chart, and the only question this story ever really asked was why she turned toward it at all. The answer is the hardest kind there is, because it is so small. A man wanted to be admired. He took the safeguards off, one by one, and leaned his ship toward the rocks to be seen. And the sea, which asks for so little and forgives so little, simply took what he handed her, and closed over the place where the Costa Concordia had turned, and washed the island's shore as though nothing had ever stood there at all. If her last hours stayed with you, subscribe, because there is always another great ship and another final night waiting to be told. And tell me honestly, If you had stood on that bridge and seen the white water break over the rock, do you believe you would have turned in time or told the truth in the hour that followed, when everyone aboard was still being promised that everything was under control? Say where in the world you are watching from, and I will read every reply.